What's up, everybody? Welcome into DodgerHeads, presented by DodgerBlue.com, part of the Blue Wire Podcast Network. My name is Jeff Spiegel, joined today by Lance Brozdowski, player development analyst for the Marquee Regional Sports Network, covering a lot of Cubs stuff. And we're going to get into some pitching sort of nerdiness, which I love. And you're great at this, Lance, so I appreciate you joining us. How you doing today?
I'm great, man. Yeah, I love the Dodgers. They're a fun team. I think anytime, as a nerd, really liking, player development. I love player development. I love changes and analyzing what's happening with a pitcher. And the Dodgers do this a lot. So anytime they acquire someone or a guy has a run where he's successful, I'm always looking at like what they changed and did differently.
Yeah.
And the Dodgers have some fun cases for sure.
I love it. Well, I'm going to rattle through a bunch of names, but I got to ask first, are you guys taking good care of our guy, Cody Bellinger, over there in Chicago?
Yeah, man. I can't believe how good he's been, honestly. And he's doing it in a really odd way. It's like like the underlying stuff isn't totally insane, Like he's not barreling the ball 20% of the time. His EVs are down, his velocities are down, but like he has been incredible 2 strikes. Like I think they've really just simplified the approach a bit. I don't think he's ever going to get back to like 30, 35 home run pop, but I don't know if he needs it anymore. So this has been kind of an interesting reclamation project by Dustin Kelly, the hitting coach here, who is a former Dodger guy, actually. So,
yeah, no, I mean, look, I don't think any of us saw it coming, but his deal is like, if you could just be sort of around league average as a hitter and play incredible defense in center field, there's going to be value. So I'm happy for him. Bummed that it's not happening here, but also understand why he left. So, all right, let's just rattle off some pitchers for the Dodgers. And you give me sort of what you've seen of late, any nuggets that you've got. And I'll start with the guy that maybe as we record this is sort of the most interesting name on this list, and that's Lance Lynn, a guy the Dodgers went and acquired at the trade deadline. He had the worst ERA in baseball, and then he comes to the Dodgers, and like in his first 3 or 4 starts, he looks like he's one of the best pitchers in baseball. Is this a change of scenery thing, or is there actually a tangible difference in what Lance Lynn is doing?
I think it's a combination. When a guy gets traded, like I said, that I really enjoy like these changes in guys. When someone goes to a new organization, most of the time, right off the bat, I don't think you see dramatic tweaks to mechanics, shapes, or anything. Usually, I think what teams are playing with right off the bat is more usage. Because that's probably the easiest thing to tweak and not have the guy be overwhelmed. And that was the case because he faced the Oakland Athletics in his first start as a Dodger. And I was like laughing. I like one of my I started making like short form content, doing some stuff on TikTok. I don't know what I'm doing there. I don't think anybody knows what they're doing there. But I'm trying to have fun with it, And one of my best videos was talking just through the fact that Lance Lynn threw like 85% four-seam fastballs to lefties against the Athletics.
Yeah.
And I was just like, this is insane, Like it seemed like the Dodgers have kind of the more game theory aspect, I think, of game planning in their heads a lot of the time when they're prepping for matchups. Yeah. So like I looked at, Oakland Athletics lefties in that lineup and was like, do they just not hit the fastball well? And for the most part, it didn't seem like they did. But I guess the Dodgers just thought, like, let's do something really outsized differently. Like, his four-seam hasn't been good to lefties, from what I understand. And yet he was able to use it a ton in that matchup, 85%. It's crazy in terms of, like, an individual handedness tweak.
Yeah.
And they kind of pushed the location to the outer third a little and just let it eat. Since then, it's come back down. So I think you can assume that was more of a matchup thing. But they have kind of flattened out the repertoire and played with some of the usage, which I think is really helping him. At the end of the day, that might be it, man. It's funny, like you talked to a lot of pitching coaches and assistant pitching coaches in baseball, and they're always like mad they can't make more adjustments to their pitchers, I think is a resounding thing you'll hear. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think some are justified as well, especially when a team has a massive investment in a guy. But one of the things that, I think is really funny is when a guy changes teams or is very bad is when you then see the adjustments. And I always wonder, like, what if the guy's just kind of in the middle, like a 4.3 ERA guy? Like, shouldn't he be making tweaks on that guy as well, whether it be usage or anything else? So usage is an easy one. I think a lot of teams just don't do the best job of optimizing it to lineups or don't do the best job of communicating that perhaps to the pitcher, such that then when you go out there, the guy thinks more viscerally and is like, I don't want to say throwing ego fastballs, but like runs in that situation where it's like, this guy can't hit sliders, I'm throwing it. It's like, well, the report said he can, So like the Dodgers are going to hang on those margins and be really good for a long time because they're really good at advanced reporting.
Yeah, I want to pick up on something you said. You talked about kind of how the Dodgers use this game theory sometimes when they're approaching pitchers, and then you're referencing pitching coaches. Like I'm curious from someone like you who is in the driveline world for a little bit and who sort of looks at pitching from a league-wide perspective. sometimes we're swimming in the water of Dodgers baseball so much. We hear the, Mark Pryor cooking things up in his lab kind of stories. And you see the successes of Tyler
Yeah.
Anderson, but maybe not the successes of Noah Syndergaard. Like for someone like you who looks at this big picture league wide, are there a couple things that you can point to, whether it's start to start or even just the way that they approach pitching that the Dodgers do that maybe can help someone like me explain why they're so successful with the Lance Lynns of the world?
It's tough, man. I think it's maybe I think for that I'd go more towards the minor league side.
Okay.
And I don't think I'm really spoiling anything here, but like they build pitcher, in my opinion, and I have a video coming out on this soon on my YouTube where I'm going to talk through like multiple approaches. So what I did was basically pulled minor league data from A ball up to AAA and looked at, how much teams organizationally use certain pitches, what their velos are, shapes, and tried to back into some like extension and release height stuff to get characteristics. And just took a look at outliers, and the Dodgers, I think for the most part, have one of the hardest, like they value velo a lot.
Yeah.
And they also value vertical break on four-seam fastballs a lot. So they end up top 5 on each of those. I think they're number 1 in four-seam fastball velocity from A ball to AAA. And then they're number 3 on induced vertical break. So that how much carry and backspin and ride are you getting? That's a really deadly combination to have both of those. Because you look at another team like the Guardians, who are low velo, but good shape, but know they can develop the velocity. The Dodgers as a whole just pride themselves on the velocity. I think they work backwards from fastball development.
Okay.
I think generally a philosophy they have, and a lot of other teams have as well, but I think the Dodgers just execute it better. Is just like, give me a fastball that's good, and I can give you secondaries and everything else to work off that fastball. As opposed to maybe a team like the Mariners, which I get into in this video, who throw the most sliders, throw the least amount of four-seam fastballs, and throws a ton of sinkers, where they're working from the slider, which is objectively the best pitch in baseball, splitters aside and such, but a better pitch than a fastball most of the time at generating good outcomes. They work from that slider back, I think, to the fastball, and that's why you end up with a lot of sinkers. Because if you're valuing good sliders and looking at stuff scores, that combination of velo, release, and movement, those guys are generally getting around the ball really well and probably lower slot, such that you're not getting that four-seam carry that the Dodgers are able to get. So that gives you – that's kind of how I see the push and pull. Those are probably tail ends of the spectrum in minor league development. So that maybe applies more to guys like Emmett Sheehan and Bobby Miller and others, Michael Grove, that have come up through the system. But with Lynn in particular and some of the major league guys, I do think that's just more like they know how to polish off pitchers and get them into situations where they will be more successful through game planning and small, subtle tweaks to pitch shapes.
Yeah. I'm curious, like, just quickly, like, are you buying the Lance Lynn deal? Like, I mean, I'm not expecting him to be one of the 5 or 10 best pitchers in baseball from here on out and into the postseason. But like, I mean, would you buy him as a guy that's like a, 3.5-ish ERA guy from here on out?
Yeah. I think 3.5 to 4 is fine. Like they needed starting pitching. Like you saw that throughout the entirety of the year. I don't know necessarily if they wanted to promote Emmett Sheehan and some others. Bobby Miller, I think, was on the verge regardless. But like Sheehan felt to me like, okay, this guy was in Double-A. Like, they're using a different ball there. He comes up and he's kind of trial by fire. And I still love him as a prospect. It's just I don't necessarily know if it was his time. But you also get the pressures of like, you can't fall that much behind such that the run they're on now, has a different effect. So like, I think they played some calculus there and brought him up. I don't know if they wanted to internally. But I buy him as like a 3.5 to 4. I just think the Dodgers extract more value out of these guys than other teams. And especially when you're talking a top 5 team in development and polishing, and the Dodgers and probably a bottom 5 one in the White Sox, even though I think Katz there is a great pitching coach. I just don't know if he has the infrastructure around him. The pitching coach can only do so much. There's a lot of other people below the pitching coach that influence decision-making, I think, a lot in other organizations. So I love the Pryor lab, but there's a lot of other people there that are all on it. I'm fine giving the kudos to Pryor, though. I've never talked to him. I don't know him personally, but from all the interviews I've seen and what I understand from talking to other people in the org, he's the savant. He's the king.
It's awesome. Yeah, the Sheehan piece, like I always try and tell people, Pepio was supposed to be the number 5 starter, and then he gets hurt, and then Grove was next, and then Stone was after him, and then Miller was after him. And so it's like Sheehan was 9th or 10th on the organizational depth chart, like coming into the season.
Stone I forgot about too. That's a good one.
So it's like you just go down that list, and it's like, well, then Pepio's hurt, then Grove was pitching poorly and got hurt, and then Bobby Miller came up, and then Syndergaard was terrible, and Kershaw was hurt. I mean, it was just a perfect series of events that led to Emmett Sheehan not even technically was promoted to AAA, never pitched there, but it's interesting. Let's stick. I mean, while we're talking about it, Emmett Sheehan, you mentioned it. he was probably a guy that from a prospect perspective, like I just mentioned, I mean, he was 4th or 5th probably among Dodgers pitching prospects coming in, behind Stone, behind Pepio, behind Miller. Now he's like, it seems like organizationally, he's probably 2nd. A lot of people that I've talked to that are in the prospect world, and I'll say, hey, would you rather have Emmett Sheehan or Gavin Stone, who Stone was a top 50 guy on most lists? And basically everybody says Sheehan now, which is interesting. Obviously, Stone struggled at the majors, struggled at AAA. The ceiling's a lot lower on him. But what have you seen from Emmett Sheehan and kind of like, are you buying into that hype a little bit of this is a guy who's made a pretty significant jump this season?
It's a good point. So the thing that I always run into that's a huge issue, especially with minor league data, there's a guy, Jeff Ponce of Baseball America, who does a great job pulling data. I think him and I used to work together at Razzball and then a couple other places. He's a great dude, but he does a lot on the data side, especially on the minor leagues. Below AAA data isn't really public for the most part. So AA specifically, you can look at that data, which I got for Emmett Sheehan when he came up, and it looked amazing. And what you've realized more over the last couple of years is that they don't use the same baseball that they use in the major leagues. So they're using a slightly different manufactured ball. I don't know what's specifically different about it. And then the weirder thing you throw in a wrinkle, the Dodgers Tulsa's not in the Southern League in the AA, but the Southern League used a pre-tacked baseball, experimental ball. That was a major league baseball that they used the company Dow Chemicals to like pre-apply a uniform tack to. They used that until like July 25th. So now what you have is like 3 different baseballs, the major league ball, which AAA uses. Then you have the AA baseball, which Emmett Sheehan used, and then you have the AA pre-tack baseball, which is actually a major league baseball that the Southern League used. So when you're looking at all this data in AA, like it's really frustrating to then run it through a stuff model. Like I have access to Driveline stuff model. Kudos to them again for giving me that, even though I don't really work there anymore. And you look through it, you put it through, and you see Sheehan has like 18 inches of carry from like a 5.4 release, and you're like, okay, like that's probably plus, you know? And then I've realized more and more as you look at data like that in the minors that when they then get up to the major leagues, there's some bit of a correction. And I think Sheehan, thinking back to some of his interviews, mentioned this a bit where he's getting more comfortable with the ball. So what happened when he came up to the major leagues is that carry dropped. Generally, from my understanding, like whether it's pre-tack ball or the AA ball Tulsa uses, you just run into, there's more aggregate total movement on the ball. So everything kind of contracts a little. So when you get that really efficient four-seam fastball he throws from an interesting slot, you see it at 18, he comes up and it was like 15. And that's a huge difference. You know, you're talking about like a standard deviation above average to slightly below average. That is a huge outsized effect on how you project him, in my opinion. So the problem I think you run into is like in AA, it looked amazing. And then he comes up and it's a little different. And then you saw subtly as he was in the majors, it started to increase back. I think that was a product of him raising release height slightly, which I would assume is a product of the Dodgers trying to figure out where that optimal fastball is with the major league ball. That gets back to the point I just mentioned earlier too, where like, I don't necessarily know if they wanted him to come up because they probably knew he was going to deal with that. Yuri Perez dealt with a similar thing in AA, jumping from AA to the majors. I don't necessarily know whether the Marlins kind of cared. He had some shape changes as well. Happened slightly with Brian Wu and a couple others from AA that jumped up in the Mariners org. It's just, it creates a limitation for us on the public side who could get that AA data as to how to analyze a pitcher, you know? And maybe that goes back to the side of like rely more on the scouting and rely more on what you think pitchability is and some of the other things that are a little less tangible. Or you could just take 2 inches off every fastball you're looking at, you know? So that I think affected him to some extent. And I'd be curious this offseason if he's just only throwing Major League Baseballs. Maybe they were doing this in the past, you know, such that he's more comfortable with the ball. They figure out what fastball is the best for him. But he's flashed, you know, I love the changeup there, even though that's more of a chase pitch. You know, I think they're just going to probably encourage velo with him, figure out fastball shape. I'm definitely watching release height in him for every start I see. And I think that's slowly ticked up. I'm not sure what it is in the last couple outings of his, whether it be in the majors, minors, whatever. But I still like him as a prospect. Yeah, I think he's one of the top arms probably in the minor leagues.
I love the base. I mean, it's like we can't get into the baseball and Major League Baseball and how they have yet to figure out the ball. I mean, but it's just I hear this.
I don't even know that. Yeah, there's better people for that. The minor league one to me is just like a weird one because it screws with the data. Yeah.
Let's stick with the young guy thing and go to Bobby Miller. 3.7 ERA this year as we're recording this. The expected ERA is right there as well. So it's, you know, we're not looking at a fluke necessarily. But what's interesting is I look at his Savant page and it's kind of like everything's sort of average. Like nothing's really in the top 30% or in the bottom 30% of anything. The K rate and the whiff rate aren't that good for a guy who throws 100 miles an hour, like maybe you'd expect. Although as Dodger fans with Bruce Dark Gratterall and guys like that, we're kind of used to 102, not missing bats. But 41st percentile strikeout rate, 36th percentile for whiff rate. And yet on the flip side, you look at Stuff Plus, he has 5 pitches that are all above average in the Stuff Plus model. So like this is a guy who coming up was, one of the best pitching prospects in all of Major League Baseball. We knew the velocity, as you're talking about, the fastball stuff, the sinker stuff. Do you, like, from what you've seen and as you're tracking, I know we're dealing with the small sample size, but has anything changed in the way you've thought about Bobby Miller, either positively or negatively? Or is this kind of like, yeah, this is about what I expected?
Yeah, I think it's probably trended positively for me. I feel like people kind of forgot about him a little entering the season, if I'm thinking back correctly, where Stone was really hyped and it was like, ooh, is it Bobby or Stone? Is it Bobby or Stone? And like, from what I understood internally, it was always Bobby, like in terms of who they valued more. So listen, he throws really hard. I think getting back to your point about like all the Stuff Plus is great and yet some of the results aren't. We've seen that with a lot of young guys who come up, specifically in the Mariners org. I don't mean to keep going back to the Mariners org, but like Bryce Miller, some of these, like Bryce Miller's a great example where like he comes up and everyone's like, that might be the best fastball I've ever seen. And then like he can't strike out more than a batter an inning. And you're like, what is going on here?
Yeah.
So I think that gets to the point of like Stuff Plus can get you really, really far, but it's not going to get you all the way. And the more and more we've seen guys jump up to the major leagues with good stuff, major league stuff, which you can objectively look at just by looking again at AA or AAA or single A data.
Yeah.
I think it's starting to confirm that there's other things to pitching. As to whether we'll ever be able to quantify those, I'm not entirely sure. We're making attempts with things like Saris's location plush on Fangraphs. Driveline has their own command plus model, which I look at often. And there's sequencing effects.
Yeah.
A variety of other things. There's probably game planning that matters. Getting back to like how much are you sticking to the game plan on the mound? I imagine the Dodger young pitchers are probably pretty good at that, given how good their analytics department is and on-field application of those analytics. But Bobby's a great example. Like I just pulled up his page. Yeah, he's like, I think Saris's standard deviation for his stuff is somewhere around 12. So like if you get into 112, that's great. You get into 124 plus, you're like, oh yeah, you know what I mean? That's an ace. And Bobby's like 131 overall. Everything is like he's 6 pitches above average. They gave him a sweeper, which I think helps a little bit with swing and miss to righties. I see some things you'll see often with these guys who throw, like I call it the Dodger slider, where it's like it's not purely a bullet on its way to the plate. It has a little bit of tail, but it's like in between that pure bullet and a sweeper. I call it like the Dodger slide. You can call it like a baby sweeper, whatever you want to call it. Dodgers love this slider, giving this slider to guys. And I think this goes back to the point of the fastball, is the fact that they get behind the ball really well. They prefer that fastball shape. If you're behind the ball really well and creating good backspin and movement on your ball, your fastball, it's limiting the amount of breaking balls, limiting the options of breaking balls you can go to from a shape perspective. You'll hear that a lot on the pitch design side. It's like, oh, he gets behind the ball really well. We can only do so much with the breaking balls. That's why I think the sweepers come into vogue more, because that allows you to set curveball out of hand. So you can throw a curve, you can throw a sweeper. Does it fit in everyone's repertoire? Completely another story. But Bobby Miller is a good example of, on the slider side, like take this short slider and just keep ripping it harder. And you'll see like on plots of it, it just slowly rises, generally because as you're throwing a ball harder, you're behind the ball more. Gets back to our point again, behind the ball more creates a little more lift. And then that goes back to a trade-off of like, okay, more lift generally means less swing and miss. So do we think this trade-off is good? Do we just want to push the velocity and see where the velocity ends up? I have that slider now at like almost 90 miles per hour. I think he came up, it was like 88. I've seen it up to like 92 as well. So they're playing with that. I wonder if they're still trying to find the perfect balance of it. But it's a really good mix. Like I think he's got frontline starter potential, I'd be stunned if he's not a big piece of this rotation in another 2 years, I would say.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me ask you about one more starter, and then I know you kind of did a deep dive on one of the Dodgers relief pitcher projects that's been a success. So let me ask you about Julio Urías and if you've seen anything interesting with him. He's got the worst ERA of his career. He's never been above 3.30. This year, as we record this, he's above 4.3. He's been better of late, though. Again, we're recording this probably a couple days before it posts, but as we're recording this, he's been good the last few starts. Is there anything you've noticed? I mean, velocity is always a big story with him. Like, is there anything you've noticed about Julio that explains the sort of negative regression, or are there things where you're like, I don't know, I think this is all going to normalize?
Yeah, I think this is a fastball problem for him. The velo's down there and the shape's down. And that, I think, is driving a lot of the other changes in there. So I'm not entirely sure. I'm trying to think if I'm like a Dodger coach, like how I'm thinking about this. I haven't talked to anyone internally about him specifically, so this is more speculation on my end. But you have a tail off in velo in shape of that pitch progressively through time. I have him. What is his velo? I have him 92.4 from age July 1st onward. And I think if you jump back, I only have him at like 16 inches, 16 and a half inches of vertical break. I bet if you go back to April, that's probably 17 and a half at 93 and a half. Subtle changes there, but like that has a huge effect on the effectiveness of that offering. And if you look at the funny thing here is if you look at some of the expected stats on the fastball, it's actually done pretty well, which is hilarious. But I wonder whether that's a product of like them trying to figure out the rest of the repertoire to boost the four seam up. That's kind of what I see in looking at him. They gave him a cutter earlier in the year that kind of peaked in usage, and now it's come back down. I really like that offering because his command on it was amazing. Into righties, down into righties. It worked really, really well. He's backed off that pitch since July 1st. He's thrown it like 7% of the time. I think in his last couple of outings, he really hasn't thrown it at all, or thrown it a couple times sparingly. But I saw that as like, okay. Like you give me the April, May fastball, the old Julio fastball, and then you add a cutter in. I love that. And then you see the fastball deteriorate and the cutter shape come down. And then you see slurve usage jump up. I think I had written down. Let me see if I have it here. Backed off cutter recently. Yeah, he was ripping it like 10 to 15% of the time to righties earlier in the year on the cutter. That's now down to 5%. The serve usage is up to 30%. But he's lost a lot of chase on it, which I don't know if that's a byproduct of throwing it too much. Yeah. But like his chase on that pitch is down to like 21% now, which is well below average. And earlier in the year was much higher. So my opinion of Julio is that they're trying to figure out the fastball. And I don't necessarily know if they're having trouble doing that, but they're piecing together and mixing the rest of the repertoire, similar to what they did with Lynn, right? Like, okay, maybe you have some issues here, but we think by playing matchups properly and usage properly against certain teams and advanced reporting better, we can get you back to a 3.54 ERA. I think they're trying to do that with Julio, where the slurve usage has come up above 30%. And we'll kind of see if that works. I don't necessarily know if it will. Ideally, you just want the fastball shape back. You know, you want the velo there and you want the fastball shape back. So I don't know what's going on there. Like, I don't see a massive difference in like extension or release differences. He's also heading into a contract year. So like you'd expect, like there's always that lower in the back of your head, like, ooh, contract year, this guy's gonna ball out, you know? And you see like the two biggest starters, Aaron Nola and him, have not done well this year in contract years, when generally you always think there's some bias towards it. So this might be a good kind of recalibration of like, you know, if a guy is that motivated by contract year, then you'd probably see more consistent performance in contract years. But that's kind of what I see is fastball shape down, stuff on it down. I think they're just trying to figure out the rest of the mix. I bet the fastball rebounds if I had to guess. And hopefully that helps the slurve chase, which is really tanked.
Yeah, and it's just interesting for a guy who's 27. You know, like the fastball velocity starting to dip down to 92 and a half for a guy who's like 31, 32. Like when Kershaw's velocity dips into like the high 80s, you're like, yeah, this makes sense. He's thrown a lot of innings, and Julio's thrown a bunch of innings for a guy who's 27. But yeah, it's just interesting. So okay, let me ask you about one more guy, and it's Ryan Brazier. This is every year the Dodgers find one relief pitcher on the scrap heap and they become amazing. Sometimes it's Evan Phillips, who turns into one of the best relievers at baseball. Sometimes it's, you know, maybe a sort of a flash in the pan. Phil Bickford had a little bit of a run for the Dodgers after coming over for nothing. This year it's Brazier. He had some high moments with the Red Sox, but this year was not very good. Comes over to Los Angeles and his ERA is like 1 or something like that. Like, I think I looked it up at one point last week and it was sub 1 for like the last 2 weeks. I mean, the guy's been remarkable. You did a video breaking down him specifically and talking about that cutter usage, like you were just mentioning with Julio. So give me your sort of the Ryan Brazier piece. And then maybe as we close out, weaving into going back to like the Dodgers, like what is it about the Dodgers that allows them to unlock Ryan Brazier in a way that even Boston, who's believed to be, you know, one of the better organizations in the league, couldn't?
Yeah, it's a great point. I have both a Substack. I mean, if you like consume content, you want to consume more of my content, just figure out the channel I'm on. I'm doing something on there. Substack recently is basically every morning I wake up and I like rip through who changed what, and it just keeps me tabbed on the league, you know. And Brazier's fix was one that was really fun. I had a post that was just the Dodgers fixed Ryan Brazier, and I thought they did, and they have for the most part. You know, the key thing for me was just he was getting destroyed by left-handed hitting in Boston. I don't necessarily know why they didn't try to back off fastball usage there, but he was throwing it like 60% of the time, and he was getting obliterated. Like, that's one of those things where, like, even if you think the Red Sox are a good org, which I do actually have some really smart people there, especially on the hitting side. I don't necessarily know the pitching infrastructure, but I don't think they're like a behind-the-curve team, especially with a guy like Chaim Boom in the front office.
Yeah.
60% fastball that has like a 500-plus xWOBA is – like, you got to look at that and be like, stop throwing that pitch, man. Like, I don't just walk everyone. You'll have better results, you know, just like put 3 guys on and let us pull you, you know. But they just, from my understanding, I don't actually know whether this was Brazier's idea or the Dodgers' idea. My assumption is that it was the Dodgers. I've actually heard some speculation it wasn't the Dodgers and it was Brazier. I don't know. I'm not going to opine on that. But they just gave him a cutter. Like they just took the fastball usage and tanked it, brought down to like 25% or something like that. So it was 60%. Now it's down to 25, and just gave him a cutter to lefties. And that allowed, he was always decent, I think, for the most part versus righties. Even with the Red Sox, the lefties were the problem. So like, they're obviously, if you're a reliever late in games, they're going to use the lefty bat off the bench to pinch hit, face Brazier. Doesn't go well. Still throwing 60% fastball. What's going on? So they cut that down and they brought in the cutter. And the interesting thing with the cutter is that it doesn't actually grade out super well by Stuff Plus. So this gets into the whole idea of Stuff Plus in situations like this probably isn't the best story, It doesn't tell all of the story. Excuse me, it's not the best story. There's more to it. There's more to what did the Dodgers see about the break of that pitch off his arm angle? I know they're a big team on just hitter reaction and understanding what hitter sees in something like that, which I think Stuff might miss most of the time. Maybe results actually capture, which is one of the reasons why I do like looking at stuff in relation to results and being like, this is 20% below average, but he's had a 50% swing and miss on it for 3 months. It's like, okay, there's something there that's missed in Stuff Plus, So that cutter's worked really well for him. I mean, it doesn't grade out incredibly well. It's like 90 to 92, good amount of backspin on it, little arm side cut or glove side cut to it. And he's just kind of ripping it to lefties, and it's allowed him to kind of stay more off barrel. Even if it doesn't grade out as like a plus pitch or get plus results, it's better than throwing the four seam 60% of the time. That was pretty much the only tweak I saw. Like, I think they just assumed he was fine versus righties, and for the most part, he has been. But otherwise, that's the main thing, is just cut that four seam usage down. They brought up his release height a little too. I don't know if that was a byproduct of other things going on, or like they cued something mechanically different for him. Usually you see extension down of just like, hey man, throw harder. We want you to get down the mound more. So you'll see extension up, and then you'll see release height drop, which makes sense if you think of like a consistent point. And then as you go down the mound, you're extending more, it's dropping a little more. So those are generally tied together. But for him, it was release height up. So I don't know if there was some mental mechanical cue in there for him to adjust, and maybe that was a byproduct of the cutter. They were like, yeah, we want you to do this slightly different. We think that allows you to kind of get to this cutter a little better. And boom, that's the result. But you see this a lot of times. You saw with Yency Almonte too. I mean, I don't think he's been a world beater, but he was a bad pitcher with the Rockies. That was like a layup. When you come from an organization like the Rockies, you go to the Dodgers, you're like, okay, this guy's gonna be like a 2.5 ERA guy.
Yeah.
Red Sox a little different. You go, okay, interesting claim on Brazier. He's down in the minors for a little. Let's see what they did. And you're like, huh, okay. Didn't expect that. Doesn't grade out well on Stuff. Results are good. You're like, interesting. That's like one of those things that get your head spinning. Because when the Dodgers do something like that, there's more to it. I don't think they're just like, let's give him a bad cutter. And I run into this sometimes too. It happened with like Josiah Gray, former Dodger in the national system this season, where like beginning of the year was throwing this weird cutter that didn't grade out well. And I was like, ugh. I just assumed that it was the Nationals doing something weird and it didn't work. And then I found out he actually trained a drive line, and I was like, I feel like an idiot for saying that pitch was stupid. And it was like, oh, he just trained a drive line and like some synergy with the Nationals drive line, and he's been really good. But besides the point there, I mean, Dodgers are a fun team, man. I think it comes down to the people. I've said this. I was on recently on Foul Territory TV debating some player development stuff with AJ Przinsky, which was really fun. It got a little spicy, which was great. I encourage you to check that out. But yeah, I talked to just about that element of just, I think Eric Kratz literally asked me like, why are the Dodgers able to do it and the Yankees or not? Because the top was the Yankees. And I was like, I think it's the people. Like, I think a lot of these teams have the same information. And the thing I've heard consistently in the Dodgers org and talking to people there is like, they do not lose the people they don't want to lose. So like, if you see coaches come out of that org, like you could probably speculate it was like maybe some family thing. There's obviously always those things to consider when a coach leaves, but like they're going to retain a lot of their staff that they think is good. And awesome. I think they think those guys are good from a analytical standpoint, but also from a communicator standpoint. They have a lot of people in that org that come from really heavy analytics backgrounds that are great communicators. Rob Hill is one, former Driveline. Pryor, I imagine, is another one. Connor McGinnis, assistant pitching coach, is a great dude. There's a lot of guys in that org that are just, they're sharp. They're really, really sharp, and they do a great job. You see them getting poached to other orgs as well. Dustin Kelly coming to the Cubs, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, no, I love, first of all, that you got yourself into the Yankees can they develop hitters debate last week, which was hilarious. Because your tweet was like, I don't know, you look at all the numbers and they're great at developing exit velocity and all these things. And so that was fun.
It was great. It was a good time.
Yeah. Well, hey, Lance, I appreciate it. Folks, check out his stuff. You can see at Lance Bros on Twitter. Substack, Lance Bros.
Everything's at Lance Bros. Yeah. So perfect. Lance Bros on any platform you're on will probably get you something that's me. So
awesome. Yeah. And like I would say, I have gotten smarter reading his stuff because he does a great job. And even if you're just focused on the Dodgers as a fan, just give him a follow, because chances are every few days you're going to see something. He had a post last week that caught my attention, which is why I reached out, because it was Bobby Miller simplifying things and just sort of pitch usage and that type of thing. So give him a follow. His YouTube stuff's great. Again, there's a 10-minute video on there about Ryan Brazier going way more in detail about pitch shape and location and all sorts of stuff with that cutter that he's talking about. So at Lance Bros everywhere. Lance, we appreciate your time. Best of luck the rest of the season. Just keep the Cubs out of the Dodgers' way. All right.
Yeah, we'll see, man. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks, everybody. We appreciate you for joining us. As always, you can subscribe, ring the notification bell here. If you're a podcast person listening to this, thank you. You can search Dodger Heads on Apple, Spotify, Google as well. Enjoy the rest of your day. And as always, go Dodgers.